Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. Today's edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast is focusing on school choice. What a concept. Something that's been whispered about by water coolers and in the depths of people's homes, maybe in small group meetings, but people are afraid. It's almost the third rail of American politics. But why has there been fear? Why have we allowed the teachers' unions in the government schools to hold so much sway over our society and over our families and really and truthfully over the raising and upbringing of our children? We have lots of problems in this country, and I think you can draw a straight line between government schools and many of the problems in the country today. These are societal issues. It's because the schools have failed to positively indoctrinate people to love their country, to be responsible citizens of the United States of America, and to pass those concepts on to the next generation. If you look around the world, you'll find many places that allow the money to follow the child. In other words, I cannot be compelled to send my child to a government school. I can take the money that would be set aside for that and direct it to the place I want it to be directed, whether that's a private school, a religious school, or maybe even a homeschool. Yes, this is being brought to the forefront because of COVID, and many people having their kids home have realized, hey, this is a different child now that they're home and they're out of this awful environment. They get a chance once again to teach their children the things they want them to learn, to keep them away from the dangerous concepts of sexuality and race that are being crammed down their throats by the government education system. It's a very exciting time, but it's also a frightening time because everyone sees the cards are on the table. We know what the teachers' unions want to do. We know what the majority of teachers in government schools want to do, not only for your children, but to your children. The evidence is clear. It's time to make a choice. We'll be talking with Corey DeAngelis when the Schilling Show Unleashed continues in just a moment.
Associated Press award-winning journalist, Rob Schilling.
BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Looking out for us. Rob Schilling.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues, and we welcome to the program Corey DeAngelis, National Director of Research at the American Federation for Children, the Executive Director at the Educational Freedom Institute, and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, a senior fellow at the Reason Foundation, and much more. Today's topic is school choice in America, an idea whose time has come. And Corey DeAngelis, welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you had to look at the present situation and the state of schooling in America today, and let's focus first on government schooling, what would you say about it?
Well, it's hit rock bottom over the past year. As we've seen, these schools have continued to get people's education dollars, regardless of how well they did, regardless whether they even opened their doors for business. You had the private schools since March 2020 fighting to reopen or had been open the entire time, whereas the public school teachers unions had fought for the opposite, had fought to remain closed every step of the way by changing the reopening goalposts. And I think the difference there is one of incentives, that one of these sectors gets your money regardless of whether they open their doors for business. And I think a lot of families have figured this out over the past year, and support for school choice, or what I call funding students directly, has soared over the past year.
You know, it's interesting. We're a homeschool family, and we have kids on the street who are in the government schools. But this year away has revealed something to the parents, and certainly to my kids who play with these kids, is that the kids, after being away from these institutions, are much nicer and much more at peace. I found that fascinating.
Yeah, it depends on the individual family, obviously, but there have been nationwide surveys by an organization called EdChoice in partnership with Morning Consult, and they've asked families ever since the school closures started and around April 2020, every month, asking them, as a result of the school closures, what are your views on homeschooling and how have they changed? Every single survey that they've done, they've found that families are now about twice as likely, or more than twice as likely, to say that they're now more favorable about views of homeschooling than they are to say that they're now less favorable than they were before. And so I think, a lot of people who wouldn't have considered homeschooling before are starting to got a little bit of a taste of homeschooling, and maybe they're more likely to support the idea, and maybe they have figured out that that their family could do it in one way or another, or maybe they figured out that they could learn twice the material in half the time if they're doing it at home, and maybe they're figuring out that their children are more interested in topics if they're participating in self-directed learning. So I think there's a lot of that, but there have also obviously been families that have needed the in-person instruction as well. But overall, the surveys that I've seen is that the views of homeschooling have gone up. And then also, if you look at the U.S. Census Bureau data from the American Pulse survey that they've done every week since the schools closed, they're estimating that about 11% of households are homeschooling full-time, not enrolled in the public system anymore, which amounts to over a tripling of the homeschool population relative to pre-pandemic levels. So there's a massive shift happening with people voting with their feet, in addition to people changing their views about how they see the factory model of schooling and how they view how we fund education. People are seeing that there's no good reason to fund closed buildings when you can fund the students directly instead. I think, when other services closed over the last year, if your grocery store closed, for example, or they didn't reopen for whatever reason, it was painful, but it wasn't devastating because people could take their money elsewhere in that case. But when your school closes, you're kind of stuck. And I think families are started to realize that, well, maybe I should be able to take my children's education dollars elsewhere in that case. So there's been legislation in over 30 states this year where legislators have introduced bills to fund students as opposed to the systems. And at least a dozen of those bills have already been signed into law. And we expect victories in at least 6 more states.
We're talking with Corey DeAngelis about school choice in America. Now, you mentioned the closed school buildings, and my question here, and I've looked at it locally, the budget didn't go down. In fact, it went up. They're asking for a lot more money. What happened to all of that money last year when all of these schools were closed and a lot of the work wasn't getting done?
They didn't know what the heck to do with the money. We have allocated through Congress 3 different stimulus plans. The first one was called the CARES Act. About $13 billion went to K-12 education. And on top of that, we've already added about $180 billion more. That is the first stimulus. That's after the first stimulus hasn't even been completely spent yet. The latest numbers that I've seen, the majority of states haven't spent the majority of the first set of $13 billion in CARES Act funding. So they have more money than they know what to do with. And I don't think it was really about safety and reopening schools. And the reason for that, partially, is because the Congressional Budget Office estimated that schools won't even spend this money until through 2028, with the majority of the money being spent after this school year. So, but if the money is supposed to be meant for reopening schools now, why would the K-12 education system plan to spend that through 2028, much after we expect the pandemic to be around and to be a big problem. And then also the U.S. Senate tried to pass an amendment to make that funding from the American Rescue Plan, $120 billion to K-12 schools, contingent upon actually reopening the schools. That shouldn't have been a problem if the money was supposed to be meant for reopening schools, but it failed. The amendment failed on a partisan 50-50 vote in the U.S. Senate. So I don't think it's been about money. I don't think it's been about actual safety concern, or it has been about money. It hasn't been about actual safety concerns. And there have been about 6 studies now that have found that places with stronger teachers unions were significantly less likely to reopen their public schools, all else equal, after controlling for a ton of demographic characteristics in the area. But studies have also found that the local politics in the area, the bluer the area was, the less likely the schools were to reopen in person. And so the takeaway there, in addition to that finding, in these other studies have found that COVID risk in the area, as measured by COVID cases per capita and deaths per capita, were not related to the reopening decisions of schools. So the takeaway there is that the entire school reopening debate has been more about politics and power dynamics than safety and the needs of students.
So if we're looking at all of this money, the piles of money coming from taxpayers and future generations, where is the accountability? Is there anybody who's taking oversight of all this money?
Well, as I said with the American Rescue Plan, they couldn't even get oversight to make the federal funding contingent upon actually reopening the schools. So I think that if there is much accountability, there's not much at all. I think the only way to truly introduce accountability into the K-12 public school system, or any school system in general, would be to fund the students directly, to allow for bottom-up accountability. All this forms of top-down accountability don't really work because they amount to a form of box checking and rules that institutions can figure out how to get around. For example, in San Francisco, in California, Governor Newsom had an initiative, a type of carrot to incentivize the public schools in the state to reopen, because, as we all know, California drug its feet as long as possible, longer than just about any other state, even though they spend about 38%. They spend about 30% more than states like Florida, which got open right away. But he introduced this incentive, about $2 billion extra to reopen schools by a certain date. The San Francisco teachers unions figured out that they could reopen for just one day, for one grade, just for seniors, before that deadline, so that they can secure the funding. But that's not exactly what families actually wanted. They would have liked the schools to have been open the full time, so that families could have that option of in-person versus remote the entire time. But because the incentive came from the top down, it was a form of box checking, and the unions figured out a way to get around it, to do the least work possible to get the most benefit. A better way of holding schools accountable is just give the money to the parents, and if the schools don't open, they can vote with their feet and go somewhere else, to the private schools that were more than happy to open their doors for business.
Corey, you've talked a lot about teachers' unions. I want to ask you how they became so powerful, and is there any way to break their hold over the system, because they're obviously destructive?
Yeah, one of the ways they've become so powerful is that we have this school system that has geographic monopolies. You live in a particular household in America. In general, this is the case with the education system, and you're assigned to a particular school just based on where you live. And if you don't like it, you can pay out of pocket for a private school tuition and fees, which amounts to paying for 2 schools but only getting the benefit of 1. Or you can move houses to a better neighborhood that's assigned to a better public school. But both of those things have high transaction costs. Just imagine if you didn't like your restaurant or grocery store that you lived near, and in order to vote with your feet and stop paying that grocery store or restaurant, you had to move your house or pay out of pocket for double the services, but only receiving half of one set of services. that would be highly costly, and it would lead to significant monopoly power for the institution that you were assigned to. So similarly, we have this problem with K-12 education where the provider of the service has much more power than the customer. And it's completely backwards of how a normal free market should operate. And so this leads to pretty much zero accountability for the teachers unions because they can lobby for policies that hurt families. And if families don't have the means to exit those institutions in a timely manner, then the teachers unions don't really have to lobby for policies that actually work for these families. That's one of the reasons. Another reason is that they lobby for policies that lead to more people in the system. So overall, we've seen huge increases in administrative bloat and staffing surges. We have just a few years ago, the number of support staff and administrators combined have outnumbered for the first time and still do the number of teachers in the system. And we have about over 6 million public school employees in the United States. The largest labor union in the United States happens to be the National Education Association, which is the largest teachers union in the U.S. And so they have a lot of power in numbers and revenues because the more union members you have, the more union dues that are being paid. If you look over time, you'll see that the unions have prioritized putting more people into the buildings than actually putting more money into the classrooms for the students. For example, between 1992 and 2014, Ben Scafidi did a report. He's an economist at the Kennesaw State University. And he found that over that time period, real inflation-adjusted per-pupil education expenditures increased by 27%. But at the same time, real teacher salaries actually dropped by 2%. So we're throwing more and more money at the problem, but it's going towards putting more people in the buildings and more administrators in the buildings, which leads to benefits for union bosses in having more political power and numbers and union dues, but not so much in terms of benefits for individual teachers in the system and families who would rather that funding go towards their students in the classroom.
You talk about the options, and for people that don't move and stay, they're being forced not only to pay twice, but to pay once to something that many people find ultimately destruction of our society, of their own kids or their neighbors' kids, and there seems to be no way out. I mean, we don't have a choice presently, do we?
In the current system, for the most part, we don't have that much choice, but so there are a good number of states that have access to either voucher programs, charter schools, tax credit scholarships, education savings accounts, and all of these in one form or another are how I would define school choice programs or what I would call funding students directly. The idea is that we have a set amount of funding that goes towards traditional schools that you're residentially assigned to, and a portion of that funding should follow the child, if not all of it, to wherever they're getting an education. It could be the public school, it could be a charter school, it could be a magnet school or a private school or a home-based option, including pandemic pods or micro schools, where the funding follows the child to wherever they're getting an education. And I think that's the paradigm shift that we've seen over the past year, that 3 nationwide surveys have found that support for school choice or funding students directly has increased substantially. For example, the latest Real Clear Opinion Research polling has found that between last spring and this spring, support for school choice jumped by 7 percentage points, from 64% last spring to 71% support among the general public this spring, with higher amounts of support among school-aged parents. And then there's 2 others, one from Morning Consult, finding increases in support for charter schools, voucher programs, tax credit scholarship programs, and education savings accounts. And the idea of the money following the child should be pretty basic. It's this idea of funding students, not systems. The reason that I argue for this is that education funding is supposed to be meant for educating children, not for propping up and protecting a particular institution. we already do this with so many other taxpayer-funded initiatives. For example, with higher education, we have Pell Grants for low-income students and the GI Bill and other taxpayer-funded scholarships where the funding goes to the student and they can choose the public provider or public university if they want, but they could also choose a private religious or non-religious university. The funding follows the decision of the student. Same thing when it comes to pre-K. We have things like the federal Head Start program and other state-funded, taxpayer-funded pre-K initiatives where the funding rightfully goes to the families, and they can then choose to go take that money to a public or private religious or non-religious provider of pre-K services. We do the same thing with so many other industries too, where the funding follows the individual. With Medicaid dollars, you can take those dollars to a public or private, even a Catholic hospital. You can do the same thing with Section 8 housing vouchers and food stamps. The food stamp funding doesn't go directly to a residentially assigned government-run grocery store, and I think everybody would find that ridiculous. Instead, the money goes to the family, and they can choose Walmart or Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or Safeway or Publix. The funding follows the decision of the person. And what's interesting to me is a lot of the people who support all of these other taxpayer-funded initiatives where we fund people instead of buildings, they get all up in arms only when it comes to K through 12 education, not for higher ed, not for pre-K, not for grocery stores. Only when it comes to higher K through 12 education do they get upset about this. And I think the only difference here is one of power dynamics. Choice is the norm when it comes to groceries and just about any other industry, and it's also the norm in any other level of education with higher education and pre-K. But choice threatens an entrenched special interest, that is the teachers' unions, only when it comes to K through 12 education. They would rather you not have that choice, because otherwise they'd be able to get your children's education dollars regardless of that choice.
So, Corey, I've been concerned over the years in interviewing politicians here in Virginia, and I'm sure they were well-intentioned, but when they put forward school choice or a voucher program, they would always tailor it to low-income groups. In other words, they said, well, let's get our toe in the water first, and then we'll expand it, which I'm always concerned at that approach. I think it needs to be taken broadly at the very beginning. In other words, we're going to provide this for everybody, and I want to get your take on that.
Yeah, I think you're right. We should go universal. I understand the other side's argument that, you want to get something in first, then it'll expand. And we have seen programs that have started small expand over time. And for example, Florida just signed into law their biggest expansion of their school choice laws in the state's history. So it can be done where you can start smaller and expand. But my approach, and I think a lot of other school choice advocacy groups approach, would be to start big. There's no reason not to introduce a bill that's available to everybody. We pay for public education for everybody, no matter what your income is. And so we have that funding allocated for every single student. It should follow every single student, regardless of your background, to wherever you're getting an education. Perhaps you have some weights for perhaps the least advantaged get higher amounts of funding than the most advantaged, but you should include everybody from the get-go. And the reason for that is because you don't want to come into a negotiation with the other side starting small, because then they'll dwindle it down even further. But perhaps you start universal, and then you have a better place to start your bargaining with the bill. But then secondly, when you dwindle it down, you don't get a lot of support from the other side. A lot of people might argue that well, if you make it only for low-income students, the Democrats are going to support it. It's very rarely the case when dwindling down the bill actually gets support from the Democrats to vote for the school choice policy. So and then when you do that, when you dwindle it down, you lose the support of your constituents. Whenever I share particular bills that are being discussed across the country, and my followers, for example, see that they're not included, they're not as riled up about the bill, and they're not going to be as likely to call their legislators to support the bill. And so when you dwindle it down, you don't make the other side happy, but at the same time you lose support on your side. So you might as well build your base and get your side excited about it by including everybody, especially when we're already paying for public education for everybody in society. So everybody should be able to take advantage of a program that's being considered. And I will say not all school choice programs are targeted based on income. For example, if you look at West Virginia, they just passed the most expansive education savings account program in the nation. And they didn't have any private school choice or even any charter schools on the ground last year. So they essentially went from 0 to 100. And I think that more states should follow their lead. And I think their programs, not income targeted, but it's not available to 100% of the population, but it'll get there. It's over 92% of the population is already eligible for the West Virginia program. So more states should take that more universal, broad-based approach to maximize likelihood of the bill ultimately passing, and then the likelihood of getting broad support for the program.
So beside West Virginia, what other state would be the top state and maybe has a track record of doing this, or we could look back and see how it's worked?
I would say the two best states for school choice right now are Arizona and Florida. As I said, Florida just passed a bill that's going to be a huge expansion, an automatic escalator, increasing that income cap each and every year unless it gets reversed by a future administration. So Florida's already doing a good job, and then they're expanding their programs massively after this year. And then Arizona has a wide range of charter school options. I believe 20% of their school-age population is attending charter schools. So they have a huge charter school market and relatively unregulated free market approach in Arizona. And then they also have several private school choice initiatives, including education savings accounts, which for the listeners, if you aren't familiar with education savings accounts, they're kind of like the voucher where the funding that would have went straight to the government institution follows the child and can be used for private school tuition and fees. But in addition to that, the education savings account allows families to use the funding for home-based instruction, online learning, tutoring, special needs educational therapies, and any government-approved education expenditure. It's not only limited to private school tuition and fees. So those states are great. And then another big win this year was in Kentucky. They passed what's going to be the second largest, behind West Virginia, second largest education savings account program in the nation. And that was an interesting fight in Kentucky because their governor, Andy Beshear, a Democrat, vetoed the bill, which was a school choice bill. And what was interesting there is that he actually attended private school himself and sent his kids to private school, but then he turned around and vetoed a bill that would have allowed other families to have access to educational choice. But luckily, or thankfully, the Kentucky legislature had the votes to overturn his veto. So those are a couple states to look at. I always tell people to look at Arizona and Florida for things that they've already done, already had in place that have worked successfully on the ground.
Finally, Corey, in places like Virginia that is run by Democrats and they're making things worse and not better, is there any hope or any path of direction for our listeners today who want to get involved but are not sure how?
Yeah, I would say contact your legislators to tell them that you care about this issue. If the legislators are only hearing from the teachers' unions, that's an easy calculus for them in their head. If they hear that from one side that school choice is bad, but then don't hear from parents and families, people who are actually mostly affected by these programs, since their kids are the ones that can use them and who are struggling in the current government-run school system, they need to hear from families. And I think if there's enough pressure that's applied from families and families become their own special interest group and advocate for their children, you might change some minds of legislators. And then also, I think if Republicans start making school choice a Republican issue, which I think it already is at this point, but if they hold on stronger to school choice, Republicans have a lot to gain here because it's a perfect wedge issue that it should be a nonpartisan issue. It's just the power dynamics play out in a way to where the Democrats receive a lot of their campaign contributions from the teachers' unions. If you look nationally from the American Federation of Teachers, for example, 99% of their campaign contributions went to Democrats in the most recent election cycle. That's part of the reasons why Democrats in office have been voting against, even though their constituents overwhelmingly support school choice policies. So if Republicans start to call that out and make it a voting issue for their constituents, they might be able to take some of the voters on the margin. And then if that happens, I think Democrats will have an even stronger incentive, Democrats in office, to change their minds about how they vote for or against school choice going forward. So I think that's a good path forward. If Republicans start to dig into school choice even deeper, Democrats may follow.
That would be a wonderful thing. Corey DeAngelis, if people would like to be in touch with you or get more information on the work that you do, how can they?
You can follow me on Twitter. It's at DeAngelis Corey. But then also my website is federationforchildren.org. That's the American Federation for Children website, federationforchildren.org.
Corey DeAngelis, thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.